So the fantasy football season, quick season it was here, and a lot of guys had good years and stuff. But I'm gonna go through the top 15 busts of the season here in fantasy football. The first one was the first pick overall in just about every fantasy draft, and that's Christian McCaffrey. McCaffrey, what a season he had in 2019. What a monster year. So that made him the first pick overall in all fantasy drafts, and rightfully so. But this season, the injury bug caught up to McCaffrey. He only played 3 games. And for him to be a number one pick and only get 3 games out of him, that's a tough battle for you this year. Must have been in fantasy football. But Christian McCaffrey next year, if he's healthy, he's still going to be a top 5 pick, in my opinion. But this year, he's definitely a bust, like I said. He only played in 3 games, but he performed top number 1 numbers in those games. But McCaffrey, this season, the injury bug got him, and hopefully it was just one fluky season, but he was definitely a bust. He was the number 1 pick, like I said, in just about every draft, and hopefully next year he bounces back. The second bust of the season was Saquon Barkley of the New York Giants. Another season where Barkley got hurt this year, and he was another guy drafted anywhere from 2 to the 5 range in fantasy drafts. And Barkley, he was done after week 2 with the torn ACL versus the Bears. And Barkley, he's concerning now, because now he's been hurt 2 out of the first 3 seasons he's been in the NFL. Obviously, he's an amazing talent, a great ball player, is Saquon Barkley, but a guy I just can't count on now. The way he runs the football and plays the game, he's not going to last long in this league. The way he does his cuts, trying to hurdle guys, and the contact he takes. A Saquon Barkley next season, I'm definitely not going to take a first-round pick on him. If he falls to the second round, great. But now getting injured and missing a lot of time the last 2 years, he's a guy definitely a bust, and a guy you got to watch out next season and probably try to avoid early on in your fantasy drafts. The third bust of the season is Ezekiel Elliott of the Dallas Cowboys. And this doesn't have to do with an injury. Elliott, he only missed 1 game this season. He's pretty much one of the most durable backs in the NFL over the last few years is Elliott. But this season, the rushing yards are way down. He only had 960 rushing yards. I know the injury to the offensive line and Dak Prescott didn't help Elliott's case, but Elliott, he's only had 3 double-digit fantasy games since week 5 when Dak Prescott went down. So Elliott, he was a top 4 or 5 pick in most fantasy drafts, but he didn't live up to the fantasy numbers this season. The injuries definitely had to do with it, but also his explosiveness and his speed has definitely gone down a notch the last few seasons, and especially this year. I feel like Tony Pollard, he ran a little better than Elliott. So hopefully next season everyone gets healthy on the line and Dak Prescott comes back and Elliott could be a good fantasy player. But this year, where he was drafted and with him playing all the games, the production wasn't there like it's been in other seasons. And Elliott, he's probably going to be in the second round, I would say, next season, or late first in fantasy drafts, because his burst definitely gone this season. And he didn't have a lot of help on the O-line, but I think it's a little bit of both him declining and his better years behind him. The next bust this season, the 4th guy, Michael Thomas of the New Orleans Saints. Thomas, he got paid. He got his big money last season after a huge season he had. And Michael Thomas, it was just a weird season in my opinion, with the ankle, the hamstring. Then there's weeks he got into a fight with a teammate. So Thomas, he ended up playing 7 games this season. And he didn't have great fantasy days, to be honest. There was a few games he just didn't do much. That's because Taysom Hill as well was starting a few games. But Thomas missing most of the season. He was out from weeks 2 all the way to week 8. Then he came back from week 9 to 14. So Michael Thomas, like I said, you only got 7 games out of him. He didn't have great games when he played. He only had 2 or 3 solid fantasy days, was Michael Thomas, and he definitely was a bust. Another top 5 pick, and it seems like most of the first round picks in this year's fantasy drafts were bust. And Michael Thomas next season, it's possible he could bounce back, but we don't know if Drew Brees is going to play 1 more year. That's still to be seen. But Thomas next year, definitely not taking him in the first round, and he's another player I might try to avoid. He got his money now, and who knows, he might just be mailing it in, is Thomas. I definitely didn't trust him, and this season I traded him away, and that actually helped me make the finals in 1 league, getting rid of Thomas. But I just couldn't get the job done, finishing in second. The fifth bust this season was Julio Jones of the Atlanta Falcons. I was big on Julio Jones this season, and I actually had him in 3 leagues out of the 5 I was in. And Julio Jones, another riddled season for him. He missed 7 or 8 games this year, was Jones. He put up some good numbers, though, in the games he did play, and now his time with the Atlanta Falcons could be finished. But Jones, he was a player I took in the late first round in most of my drafts, and the production wasn't there. He couldn't get the job done some weeks, and the injuries were just a problem. And this Falcon team, they were out of all sorts. The coaching staff wasn't good, and Julio Jones, I think he's going to get traded, and we'll see what he lands. But next season, I'm definitely not going to target Julio Jones unless I could steal him in the 3rd or 4th round of fantasy drafts. After this disappointment this season of missing games and having bad performances here and there as well, Julio Jones, I don't think he was worth it this season in the 1st round, and he's definitely a bust. The 6th bust of the season was James Conner of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Conner, he started off the year with great numbers and good fantasy production, but then the injury bug set in a little for Conner, and then there's some games where they just totally went away from him, and they were just throwing the ball the rest of the game. James Conner, last week he had a good game in Week 16 to finish the fantasy year, but once again he only got 5 carries for 20 yards and a touchdown, and that was his first double-digit fantasy game since Week 11, and then before that it was Week 8, so Conner, the first 7-8 weeks of the season he was good, and then he faltered off and had a bad fantasy season, and he was a running back drafted in the late 2nd, early 3rd rounds, and he definitely was a bust. He didn't put up huge numbers. He wasn't reliable. He missed a bunch of games, so he was definitely a bust in my opinion, and hopefully next season he comes back. Mark Ingram is the next bust at number 7. Mark Ingram, this season we thought he was going to have a similar role like he did last year, but J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards got a lot of work back there in the Baltimore backfield, and on the season he only had 260 rushing yards with 2 touchdowns was Mark Ingram, when last season he cracked 1,000 yards. So Ingram, with the injuries and the decline in play, he was a total bust, and he was a running back taken in the 3rd or 4th round of many fantasy leagues, and he was a guy by week 4 or 5 who was droppable. So he's one of the biggest busts here in the 2020 fantasy season, and hopefully next season Mark Ingram, he gets things going and he could get back to a decent form, but I think he'll be gone from Baltimore. They got J.K. Dobbins. The time's now for him to take over, and Mark Ingram, they'll probably cut him in the offseason, but he was definitely a total bust this year. The 8th bust of the season, Odell Beckham Jr. of the Cleveland Browns. Beckham, it just hasn't worked with Cleveland. He had one huge game in Week 3 versus the Dallas Cowboys where he threw for a touchdown and he caught 2 of them. But since that game, he didn't do much with Beckham. He only had 2 good games this fantasy season. He got hurt with the torn ACL, and he was out from Week 7. And Beckham now, the last 2 or 3 seasons, mediocre numbers at best for Beckham. He's had injury history now with the leg injury, the torn ACL this season. And next year, I don't think he'll be on the Cleveland Browns either. And honestly, he's going to be a flex to a bench receiver in most fantasy leagues, especially if he lands somewhere else. I think his best seasons are behind him. The explosiveness, it's going to go down even more with this ACL injury. And Odell Beckham, he was great for the first few years with New York, but now his stats have gone down, and he was still getting overrated in many fantasy drafts, going the 3rd and 4th round, and he didn't get the job done even when he played. And then the injury made him a total bust this season. The next guy's DJ Chark of the Jacksonville Jaguars. DJ Chark, another season this year for him where we thought he would break out like last, but this year he was injury prone and he didn't have great games either. A lot of single-digit fantasy games for DJ Chark, who was a lot of people's number 2 to flex receiver in their fantasy leagues. And DJ Chark, next season, we'll see if he stays with Jacksonville. Trevor Lawrence, he's most likely going to be the quarterback if they're going to get that first pick, which they are, Jacksonville. So that might help them. This year, like I said, it was a tough year with the injuries and 3 different quarterbacks starting behind center for Jacksonville. So hopefully next season, DJ Chark will bounce back, because this guy was a great talent last year, and in college football for LSU, he was a good ball player. So Chark, maybe it was a down year, but he was definitely a bust where people took him and starting him as their number 2 or 3 receivers. The 10th bust, of the fantasy football season was Zach Gertz of the Philadelphia Eagles. Gertz, he was injured as well, but he played the first 6 or 7 weeks, and his numbers were mediocre to poor at best at the tight end position, where in PPR leagues he only had the whole season 2 double-digit fantasy games with Gertz out of the 11 he played. So Zach Ertz, the injuries were there. Him and Carson Wentz weren't on the same page, and he's declining a little as well, where he wasn't getting open as much on those routes that used to be his bread and butter. So Zach Ertz, he's a free agent after the season, and we'll see where he lands in the offseason with his new team, because I don't think Philly's going to take him back. They got Dallas Goedert, he's ready to go. It's the Jalen Hurts era over there in Philly, even though he hasn't had a victory as a starter yet. He's 0-3, but Hurts, he's got all the makings of being a great quarterback and definitely good for fantasy football. So he's a guy to keep an eye on next season, is Hurts. And Zach Ertz, he was a total bust this year, and a lot of people took him 4th or 5th round, or maybe even early in their fantasy drafts, and he didn't live up to that. The 11th bust of the season was Lamar Jackson, the MVP from last season. Jackson, he had a lot of mediocre games the first few weeks of the season and middle of the season, but he really picked it up from week 13 on, was Jackson. But it might have been too late if you had Jackson taking him in the 2nd or 3rd round, which he won a lot in fantasy leagues, and you didn't make the playoffs. Those week 13 to 16 games didn't mean nothing because you were out of it already. So Jackson, he had a lot of mediocre games with 18 to 20 fantasy points, and where you drafted him, like I said, he was a total bust, but it looks like he's getting things going now, and we'll see what Jackson does in the playoffs for this Baltimore team if they get in now. But Lamar, I think next season he'll be a little better. I'm still not taking him 2nd or 3rd round. That's way too early for a quarterback, unless it's Patrick Mahomes, who once again proved he had a monster season. But Lamar Jackson, he was a definite bust this season for where he got taken, but he still ended up the season with pretty decent numbers. The 12th bust, Juju Smith-Schuster of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Smith-Schuster, he was another highly rated wide receiver taken this year. People thought this would be the season he finally breaks out with Juju, but a lot of up and down games. He only had 760 yards receiving this year. The 8 touchdowns saved him in fantasy, but this guy, he hasn't cracked 100-yard performance since Antonio Brown was on the team. So Juju, he's not really the number one. Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool, I believe, had better fantasy seasons than Juju Smith-Schuster. So Smith-Schuster, last week it was good to see him have a nice bounce-back game, but he was a definite bust where you took him because he had some mediocre to poor performances 4 or 5 weeks during the season, and his highest fantasy day was 24-60, which was last week, where he had 96 yards and a touchdown. So Juju Smith-Schuster, people had high hopes. A lot of people had him as their number 1 or 2 receivers in fantasy leagues, but he didn't live up to the build or the hype. So hopefully next year he bounces back. The 13th bust was Clyde Edwards-Helaire, the rookie running back for the Kansas City Chiefs. Helaire, he had a decent rookie season, but as far as where he got drafted, middle of the 1st round to late 1st round, he didn't put up that great of numbers. 800 yards rushing, 4 touchdowns, and 36 catches for 300 yards and a touchdown. So Clyde, he didn't get over 1,000 yards. He only had a total of 5 touchdowns, which isn't great. And he was a 1st-round pick. That opening game of the season, he looked amazing with 138 yards and a touchdown. And me and a lot of people thought, yeah, maybe this guy's onto something. But I avoided him in fantasy drafts. I didn't think he would have a monster season for where he was going from the 6th to the 10th pick in most drafts. And I was right about that, I guess. He had a mediocre year, like I said, with 1,100 yards total and 5 touchdowns. So Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he had a decent season in terms of a number 2 to flex running back. But as an alpha number 1 and 1st-round pick, he was a total bust. The 14th pick this season, who was a bust, was Levion Bell. He started the year with the New York Jets, and then he went to the Kansas City Chiefs, and he was a guy on a lot of rosters that was your number 2 running back, and he was going anywhere from the 3rd to 5th round in fantasy drafts. And Levion Bell, his best days are behind him. The Jets, they looked like they were correct at cutting him, because this guy, he only had 2 double-digit fantasy games the whole season, and last year he had a decent season, 800 yards rushing, 3 touchdowns, and he had the 460 yards receiving with a touchdown. But this year, between Kansas City and the Jets, 82 rushes, 328 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, and 138 yards receiving. So Levion Bell, I know he's behind Hilaire. I know with the Jets it didn't work out, but Levion Bell, he don't look as explosive. His receiving skills have gone down a little as well, and he was a total bust of a guy people were relying on as the number 2 to flex running back in most fantasy leagues, and he couldn't even put up those type of numbers. He was a bench player at best this season in fantasy. At that point, he's just a name. And the 15th and final bust was Tywin Higby of the Los Angeles Rams. Higbee, what a great season he had at the end of last year. He was a top 5 tight end, but this season was a mediocre to poor fantasy play with only 3 double-digit fantasy games. And this is in PPR leagues. So Tywin Higby, he wasn't getting the job done. This Ram offense was run more this season than last after Todd Gurley kept getting injured last season. So Higbee, people had high hopes for him, but he was a tight end. After week 5 or 6, he wasn't usable for most fantasy leagues. So Tywin Higby was a bust. I thought he would have another good season, and I had high hopes for him, but he had a bad year with Higbee, and he was a tight end taken in the 6th to the 7th round in most leagues, and he was a total bust. Maybe next year he could bounce back, but this season his numbers were nothing special at all for Higbee. 41 catches, 480 yards, and 5 touchdowns. So Tywin Higby was the bust, and that's the top 15 busts I had this season for the fantasy football season.